We interrupt the program for a special announcement.
I'm super happy today to be able to talk to you about Raspberry Pi 5.
Yes, you heard right. The Raspberry Pi 5 is here and with some interesting innovations that will surely please many of you, including more power, PCI Express and more. But wait a minute, the year is not even over? Not only you are surprised, I've been following the topic for quite a while. So far the official stand was that one would like to restore the first half of 2023 first the ability to deliver, which was successful. Since July, things have gradually returned to normal. The second half of the year was supposed to be spent planning new hardware, which would then be released in 2024 at the earliest. Up until a few weeks ago, Upton confirmed this in an interview and even left it open for which model a successor could be released. Now, everything obviously went much faster than expected and there is a lot of positive news, which we'll now look at together below. One of the biggest news is the processor as the core. A 2018 introduced ARM Cortex-A76 CPU was installed. It has 4 cores with 2.4 GHz each and is in the Broadcom BCM2712 system on a chip. For comparison, in Raspberry Pi 4 it is the BCM2711 also with 4 cores. Originally, they were clocked with 1.5 GHz. Later, they were officially overclocked to 1.8 GHz. The A76 also contains cryptographic extensions, which means that a significant performance gain can be expected for encryption and decryption. A Video Core 7 graphics processor with open-source Mesa drivers is also installed. It has also become more powerful, which means that you can now use 2 4K screens with 60 frames per second, according to Upton. This was already possible with the Quad, but only on one screen. If you wanted to connect 2 screens, you had to use 30 frames per second. According to Upton, the processor and graphics performance should increase by a factor of 2 to 3, and the memory and I/O bandwidth should double. Thanks to the more modern manufacturing process of 16 nanometers instead of the previous 28, the processor is not only faster but also more efficient. The Pi 5 is therefore said to generate significantly less power and thus also waste heat than its predecessor while doing the same job. At the same time, a new power supply with 5 volts and 5 amps is introduced, so much more than the previous official Raspberry power supply with 3 amps. How does that work together? The faster new processor needs a bit more at load peaks that are up to 12 watts compared to the 8 watts of the predecessor. But there are also other reasons like the built-in PCI Express 2.0 interface. Although not everyone uses everything, there must be enough reserves that if you run AM2 SSD so that can be supplied with power by the power supply. But don't worry, you don't have to buy a new power supply. You can continue to use the old 3 amp power supply. But then the firmware reduces the current at the USB ports. There are only 0.6 instead of 1.2 amps available. For mouse, keyboard and other devices with low power consumption, this is no problem. It's different with devices like external hard drives. Especially here, the motors need a lot of energy to start up. This might not always work with the old power supply. There are further performance improvements through a more modular architecture. Instead of one large chip, one wants to divide its tasks into several smaller ones, the so-called chiplets. In concrete terms, there are now more separate chips for certain functions that were previously integrated elsewhere, i.e. mostly in the system or chip. For the first time, the Raspberry Pi 5 has its own I/O controller with the RP1. It takes over some interfaces such as USB and Ethernet. This should almost double the USB 3.0 speed. It is a large project on which the organization has been working since 2016 and has invested a total of $15 million. Nevertheless, so far relatively little is known about it. But that should change in the future still. The board looks quite similar to the Raspberry Pi 4, but the layout is not completely the same. The RJ45 network jack has been swapped with the USB ports. So the order is again identical to the Raspberry Pi 3. With the Raspberry Pi 4 it was swapped so Ethernet behind the GPIO and now swapped back again. So with Raspberry Pi 5 we have again the USB ports behind the GPIO header. For this reason alone, existing accessories such as enclosures cannot be used for the Raspberry Pi 5 without further ado. Some innovations are in the details so that they are not visible at first glance. For example, the power button that some have wished for, and now there is a small button opposite the network interface. With it, you can turn on the couple and also shut down cleanly when it is already running. But things have been removed as well. This happens quite rarely with the Pi. This time the 3.5-inch jack socket has been affected. There you could connect analog car devices, e.g. headphones. The connectors on the board are still there so that you could solder something yourself. The main reason was to save space. Instead of the jack socket, there is now a second MIPI interface. With it, you can connect cameras or monitors. Both together is also possible, for example, a camera with a screen. But the connection has been changed to a denser pin layout. So for existing accessories, adapter cables are necessary. The new format is called Mini and the old Standard. The adapter cables are available in different lengths for $1 to $3 each. Besides, there is now a separate UART jack between the two micro HDMI connectors for screens. Almost revolutionary. PC Express 2.0. In the x86 area, this has existed for 20 years for things like graphics cards and other expansion cards. Due to the high speed, it is also possible to connect SSDs there, and thus the way is now clear for corresponding hats that can be placed on top in order to be able to use, for example, M2 SSDs directly with the Raspberry Pi. A robust and faster alternative to the controversial memory cards has been demanded for a long time. Now this is possible, and there will even be an M2 hat in 2024. With it, SSDs can be connected on the Pi. So far this was only possible via USB with external SSDs or hard drives, but with limited speed, and you cannot install the whole thing so well. The micro SD slot does not disappear, but it remains on the bottom and is the standard medium for the operating system. The performance should now be twice as fast. Although still far away from the speeds of the SSDs, but still positive. There are new accessories for the Raspberry Pi 5. New is an official kit for cooling with a fan. The case has been adapted so that this active cooling can be installed. The Raspberry 5 does not necessarily have to be actively cooled. It is still designed so that you can use it for typical applications without active cooling. The cooling should be more for power users who want to use it to its full potential. A small detail on the side. You can now install the Pi into the case without having to remove the memory card first. A new power chip also brings a real-time clock. We already had this topic in the forum. In contrast to x86 PCs, the Pi has no real-time clock. That means it gets date and time only over the network. If it is operated without network and loses power, then date and time are wrong. Until now, you could only solve this with an external hardware clock, which in turn is powered by a battery. In the Raspberry Pi 5, a real-time clock is integrated. So you only have to buy for $5 a small battery that supplies this clock with power so that date and time independent of the network always votes. Together with the M2 has is 2024 also Apple has planned. About power over Ethernet, you can supply the couple over the network cable with power and network that I have already shown my own post, in which I had used an extra adapter. The network and power supply then again separates for the Pi. With the has you do not need, then you can directly plug the network cable. Parallel to the Raspberry 5, work is already underway on the next Raspberry Pi OS. It will be based on the current Debian 12 aka Bookworm. I already presented this to you in a separate post in July 2023. A number of improvements have been announced. The highlight is supposed to be the change from X11 to Wayland. X11 takes care of displaying and controlling graphical windows like when you start programs on the desktop. For decades, this is or was the standard for all Unix-like operating systems and therefore also Linux. Because X11 is increasingly reaching its limits, Wayland is establishing itself as a more modern alternative. But for this, many programs have to be adapted, so the change is slow. The Raspberry Pi OS 12 is planned to be introduced in mid-October. It is the first official operating system for the Raspberry Pi 5, but will also be offered for the predecessor Raspberry Pi 4. The official prices for the Raspberry Pi 5 are $60 for the 4GB variant and $80 for 8GB of RAM. As a private person, however, you could not convert one-to-one. They do not include taxes and shipping costs. But you can already estimate that the Raspberry Pi 5 will probably not be too much more expensive than the current Raspberry Pi 4. First stores have already listed it with a price here, for example €72.90 for the 4GB variant. Other additions with less memory are not yet known. But another renewal on the Raspberry Pi 5 gives us a hint. On the board there is now a new field where you can see how much memory it has, a very useful idea. I also had the problem that I did not know exactly how much memory a Pi has, and I had to start him to have a look. Since there are also 1 and 2 GB listed, there will be probably the same additions as with the Raspberry 4. And with the smallest, we will come back in the direction of the original $35 US. Another surprise is the release date. It is not yet available. Yes, that is actually a pre-announcement what there has not been for a long time with the Raspberry Pi. But it will not be long. From the end of October 2023 you will be able to buy it. Also an interesting news. Until the end of 2023 all Raspberry Pi 5 should be reserved for private customers. Previously, only a heart was delivered to private customers. However, the preference of enterprises was also a reason or co-reason why those were so long badly available. A substantial part went namely always to the firm customers. That caused much criticism and apparently they try to make it better now with the new model, where they prioritize private customers at least for some time. I don't think the communication was really successful. Even a few weeks before, Upton made a big secret about it, even though he was probably already working on it at that time. Just because so much work has gone into it, we had a shortage for a long time and many are waiting for the Raspberry 5. I think it would have been in the interest of the community to inform about the situation and plans in advance so people feel picked up. In terms of content, there is a lot of positive news, both about the Pi 5 and the software. According to everything that is known, the Raspberry Pi 5 will probably not break any new records in terms of performance. But he catches up and implements things that have been suggested for some time by many people. It could well be a worthy successor to the Raspberry Pi 4. I will continue to stay tuned, but remember it often does not have to be a Raspberry Pi. There are various alternatives that are at least equivalent or even better suited, depending on the application purpose to this. I have already made various posts and videos and also already tested a few devices. With that I say goodbye until the next time.